The first thing I want to make perfectly clear is that this is not a full lesson. You'll find that for free on Drawabox.com. These lessons have been around here for a while, and I just figured that it would be nice to expand on some of the core concepts and highlight important points that people tend to miss. So before you start this lesson, you should note that right here I've highlighted in red that you should read the article on constructional drawing, which you'll find here. And I go over exactly what that means, breaking down forms and stuff like that, although I'm going to touch a little bit on those concepts here as well. Also, you should be sure to check out the demos that I have at the bottom of the lesson. These are basically things that I'm adding to and that I've drawn for other students while doing critiques for them. You'll see that a lot of people tend to struggle with using rudimentary forms, constructing leaves and stuff like that. And there's a bit about texture, but really don't worry at all about texture right now. It's not even remotely important. So the constructional method is basically what we're trying to cover through all of these lessons. That will be lessons 3 through 7. And we're trying to hammer in the same idea using various subject matters. So it's like attacking the exact same problem from multiple angles. And eventually, while the first few might not quite work for you, they build up on top of each other. And at some point, the concept will click, and when it does, everything else will start to make a lot more sense. So if you struggle with one, don't worry too much. We're still going to push you right through, and assuming that you've grasped enough of the basics of each lesson, you'll eventually reach a point where everything will start to make sense. So the thing about the constructional method is the idea that everything that you could possibly want to draw is composed of simple forms. And there are different kinds of forms that we're talking about. There are geometric forms, which are your basic spheres, cylinders, boxes, cones, and pyramids, although generally we'll focus on just these three, the boxes, the tubes, and the balls. And I use that sort of informal language just to show that these kinds of objects, they don't have to be rigid and solid. They do have to be solid, but they don't have to be rigid. They can be squished and stretched and manipulated in all sorts of ways to create the kinds of forms that we're looking for. And next, you've got organic forms. And these are very similar to taking a ball and stretching it, but you're sometimes starting with a rigid geometric form doesn't quite mesh in our brains, in that since it's so rigid, it can be hard at times to manipulate it in the way that we might want to manipulate an organic form. So that's why we extend this to its own category. And so you'll find that oftentimes you'll want to reinforce organic forms with these contour curves, which we tackled in lesson 2. And the whole idea there is that the more you break away from these geometric forms, the less clear it is that the forms themselves are 3D. So what you end up getting is, if you just have a blob like this, or that, you won't necessarily read that as being 3-dimensional. Your gut instinct is that it's completely 2D. And so you want to reinforce the illusion that it exists in 3 dimensions, so that first and foremost you want to buy into that illusion. You want to be fooling yourself, because as long as you are fooled, you're going to start making little subconscious changes to the silhouettes and to the way that you draw things that will convey that impression of 3-dimensionality to your viewers. And one thing that, this is actually something that I drew from a demo a long time ago, but the idea here is that if you look at the brush strokes, you can see that that's not right. You can see that these brush strokes are flowing along the form, and they're wrapping around it. And it's not a perfect sphere, of course. It's kind of like a lumpy little person. I think that's what it was. But the idea is that when I drew this, I was convinced that this was not a 2-dimensional shape. that that you couldn't cut straight across it with your paintbrush. That I was actually painting not on a flat surface, but on a curved one. And so my brushstrokes would carve along the sides, along the surface that is. And this is the kind of illusion that you really want to maintain. So that as long as you're making these decisions subconsciously to carve along the surface, you're going to continue reinforcing that illusion. So anyone who looks at it will start to see what you see. And that's the most important thing. That's what everything else is building up towards. And so with some forms, like geometric forms, it's relatively easy once you get your angles correct to give that sense that it's three-dimensional, but when you start looking at curves and organic forms and anything like that, it starts to break down a bit. And so you need to go back and reinforce it with tools like contour lines and I mean, a lot of beginners will look to shading for this, and I try and avoid that. That's why you'll find that the majority of my lessons don't touch on any sort of shading at all. And when I do use shading, it's generally to break up forms and not to actually describe the forms themselves. It's to push certain things back and bring other things forward to organize my image. But the problem when beginners use this sort of shading to describe the form itself is that it's kind of a lower level approach to doing it. It's not entirely clear, it's more subtle, and so you have a bit of a hierarchy of how you want to go about depicting that form. So the first and most important element is the silhouette. So that would be if I just, hold on, let's see if I can do this. If I simplified it to just this block, and this shadow, this cast shadow here is not helping at all, because it's not actually part of our silhouette of the form itself. So if you get a silhouette, something like this, your gut instinct is to interpret this as a 2D form. But if you start carving those edges so that you start depicting just how the form turns in space, you can actually start conveying the idea that this isn't just two-dimensional. And it's subtle things, but it's the first thing that your eye will see in the drawing. And what your eye sees first will have the greatest impact. The problem with shading is that your eye sees that very late in its process of assessing what it's looking at, and so it's going to have much less of an impact. Let's just throw that out. And so you want to use first your silhouette, then your contour lines to describe the surface, and then last, all the way down the line, you want to worry about shading. And the thing is that when you understand how a form sits in 3D space, you don't really need someone to teach you how shadow works, because it's just a matter of some parts of that form are pointing towards the light source and some are pointing away. So the ones that point towards the light source catch the light, and the ones that aren't don't. And there are more complex levels to it where light bounces around, but it's really not important at this stage. We just want to focus on understanding how the forms themselves exist. So back to our breakdown of the different kinds of forms that you're going to run into, there's a third group. And it's just like the organic forms extend from the geometric ones, this one extends as well from organic forms in that it's these sort of flat forms that flow through 3D space. So when we think of flat, we usually think of, well, it's just going across a flat 2D page, right? But that's not the case. These are flowing from being further away from the viewer to closer to further, and so they are flat shapes, but they're still flowing through a three-dimensional world. And so you first got this ribbon here. I probably shouldn't have overlapped the different shapes this much because it's kind of confusing, but this ribbon, and it's actually one of the things that we deal with in the second lesson, that the ribbon kind of is an extension, or not an extension, a simplification of the same kind of challenges we deal with when we draw things like leaves, which are very simple concepts of, if you have a line that goes from being further away to closer, then you want to construct your whole leaf around that. Because this line initially captures the flow. That's what these ribbons are all about. It's capturing the flow of the shape through 3D space. And if you just try and capture a leaf without drawing the center line first, the problem is that you're tackling multiple challenges all at once. So if you do something like that, and seeing me do it is a little bit misleading because my brain, since I've practiced drawing these sorts of center lines and using them, my brain automatically thinks about flow and all these things at the same time, which eventually your brain will do as well. But when you start out, your brain is kind of bombarded with all these different challenges of figuring out how these little wobbly edges are going to work, and while balancing it out with how the leaf is going to flow through space. And the result is that you're dealing with so many things at once that you screw them all up at the same time. And so the result is ultimately the constructional method, which is breaking everything down into smaller steps, smaller forms, smaller challenges. And so the first thing you want to deal with here is that you want to draw your center line, the spine, the flow of the leaf, and then you want to construct the leaf shape itself around that. And then you might add a little bit more information, so say some basic contour lines to describe the form and how it distorts through space, and then you might have little edge deformation or maybe wavy edges, something like that. And you can add all sorts of detail after the fact, but the point is that you're working off a basic framework or a scaffolding. Like when you construct a building, you don't just build it up from the ground and with brick by brick. You build the scaffolding and the supports on the interior and the exterior, and then you build up the main building itself, and then eventually you take that scaffolding down. In this case, we don't take the scaffolding down because I always recommend that people work in ink, so you can't erase that. But the main thing to remember here is that we aren't after pretty drawings. We're not doing any of this to draw a beautiful drawing so we can pin it on our fridge. We are doing this to understand how these forms sit in space and how they all work together, so that eventually your brain will have so much of this ground into it that you're going to understand already how those forms flow through space, so that you don't need to rely quite so much on these constructional steps. But don't even think for a second about that goal, because you're not going to reach it for a long time, and if you try and shed the scaffolding too early, you're going to miss out on a lot and you're going to fall short. So because my explanations tend to be pretty confusing, and I tend to speak over myself a lot, I'm going to show you a couple of basic examples of what I mean. So we are going to start off with a basic leafy plant image, and we're going to talk about how the constructional method gets applied to this. So first thing you can see is that I've drawn on top of it, and that's not a good idea. Let's just switch it to red, because that's going to be more visible. That's a little better. So here you can see that I've fleshed out my pot. And it's basically, it's very similar to a cylinder. It's actually, you can look at it as a compound cylinder of one cylinder being here, another here, and so on. And the idea is that your cylinders don't have to be completely straight. They can taper, they can swell out, but the main structure of the cylinder, which you might actually want to look at the, since none of my lessons actually explicitly talk about how to construct cylinders, this 250 cylinder challenge here, which actually goes through the steps of how to use your minor axis and align your ellipses and whatnot, that you should definitely take a look at. So anyways, that sort of structure is always going to be the same through all your cylinders. It's going to be evenly shaped on both sides, symmetrical. It'll be built around a minor axis, and so on and so forth. But you can actually still make it somewhat tapered. This is a huge exaggeration. Sorry for the sloppy line work, but I'm just trying to get through this quickly. That's pretty bad. So you can have compound shapes like this. That this one expands out and then it tapers in like this, but they're still being aligned to the exact same minor axis, which is definitely important when you want to work with cylinders. Anyways, so then you've got another cylinder right here, which, if you look closely, it's actually a bundle of these, I don't know, trunks or stems or whatever you want to call them. But overall, they're bundled together to create a cylindrical shape. And we'll break them down later, but right now we just want to capture the essence of the construction. Now, things get a little bit tricky when you start looking at all of these friggin' leaves and branches and whatever they are. So I've broken down a few of them, and you've got the center lines and whatever that I've drawn in, and then I've built leaves around them like I showed before. And you'd basically do this for all of these leaves, although generally when I'm studying a plant, I'm not going to be overly preoccupied with reproducing the plant completely accurately. I'm more interested in learning how these things fit together, what kind of patterns that they follow, and whatnot, so that I can reproduce them, or so I can record that information in my brain and reproduce them at least somewhat faithfully from memory down the line if I have to. But of course, this is all still focusing on being done from observation, so we're not going to be relying on our memories right now. So the best way to depict how I use this kind of constructional information, this whole thing is not my study. This is just breaking down the forms. This is what I would do in my mind. And you can draw on top of the images if you want to, if you can. Like, you'd have to print them out for that, or do it digitally or whatever. But it's usually simple enough not to have to really draw it explicitly like this. You can see that this face is the product of multiple cylinders. So this is how I would start out my actual construction, and you'll notice that I did this at a different angle, a different perspective than the actual drawing. You don't have to do that. You can try and match what's in the image, and you might actually want to do that because it's a little simpler. But what I've done here shows that the understanding of construction will actually allow you to then manipulate the forms and put them at different angles and just capture this same object but differently, because you understand how it sits in space. So here I've drawn these cylinders that I was talking about before. So I've got my initial ellipse, and it swells out into this larger one, creating a bigger, or a tapered cylinder. And then you've got the same thing over here, where it's doing the opposite. And there actually is a little lip to this vase or pot or whatever, but I kind of skip that for now for simplicity's sake. But it's basically the same idea. You just be bulging it out like that. and so forth. So you have your lip there, and where there's thickness, always don't draw anything as being paper thin like this. This is not a vase. This is like a roll of paper. It's flat. Unless you were actually drawing a cylinder. But if this was supposed to be a hole, then it would be paper thin. And that's kind of unnerving to think about. So what you always want to do is you want to draw an inset ellipse, creating a thick sort of lip or edge. And so you've got the larger cylinder here that I've drawn. Here. The cylinder itself actually dips into the pot, so I want to draw through my pot to capture my forms in their entirety. And I did the same thing here, just a smaller cylinder. And then I broke each one down into smaller cylinders. And generally, the smaller things get, the less preoccupied I'll be with my forms coming out super accurately. It can be a little sloppy at times, but the main thing here is that form and the importance of capturing that illusion of form, it gets less important as things get smaller. Now, if your whole drawing is tiny, that doesn't mean that your biggest object, still being fairly small, like that rule applies to it. But it's a matter of relativity. So if you have a lot of huge forms in your drawing, the smaller ones, it doesn't matter as much if they read as being entirely three-dimensional. You'll notice in later lessons that sometimes I will leverage the gestural quality of a flat shape when dealing with legs, just because it comes out with a better result, instead of having to worry about how each leg kind of has a contour line and all that crap. So where was I? Okay, the next point in the construction is going to be defining the center lines of your leaves. And in this case, there's a lot of them. And I actually haven't drawn all the ones that you might find in this image because I didn't want to. It would have cluttered the drawing, and it would have taken too long, and I have things to do. So, the main thing to look at here is that I've drawn each one as a little arrow. And this is largely for my own sake, and it's also for the sake of demonstration. You don't have to do this, but what's important is that an arrow, your brain thinks of an arrow as being directional, which is super important. The second part is to acknowledge that this arrow is not flowing across the flat page again, but it is flowing through space. And you can also help capture this by using a little bit less pressure here so your lines come out thinner, and then increasing as you go, so that the thicker edge feels like it's closer to the viewer. Or you might do the opposite. I mean, if your arrow is moving further away from the viewer, it's the same principle. Now, controlling your pressure like this can be difficult, especially at the beginning, and it's one of the reasons that I insist that people use a 0.5 millimeter pen tip. I don't know why I'm drawing a pen tip here, I just kind of feel like it. That's more or less what they look like. And so the main idea is that as you add pressure, that's actually not accurate. As you add pressure to your pen tip, it's more like that. You see that this point here is actually quite smaller, but as you add pressure, this whole thing is going to compress, and the radius of your tip is going to get fatter. And you can do this gradually while you draw a stroke to cause it to be a little bit tapered at the beginning and even at the end, which adds a little bit of life and dimension to your line work. And that's important because you don't want your lines to look super uniform and like just blocky and dead all the time. It's not a very pleasant thing to look at, and it does take time and practice to get used to controlling the weight of your pen, because initially you're going to have two settings. You're going to have absolutely nothing, and you're going to have full on, because you're using muscles to control that pressure that haven't had much practice. So as you do practice that, it'll slowly start to get more nuance and you'll get more character in your drawing. And to make a little quick segue from there, that's also why if you're using a scanner to capture pictures of your homework when submitting, it's important not to use line drawing presets. Like you've usually got there's black and white drawing, color drawing. Then you've got black and white photo and colored photo. And usually scanners will have these presets among others, and you don't want to use this. You probably don't want to use this either. I haven't tried it, but I'm assuming it uses the exact same principles. What you want to use is photo. The thing about drawings is that scanners try to be super helpful and they try and make your line drawings very crisp, but in doing that they throw out all of the additional information that goes between the full black and the full white of a drawing. So instead of being more like this is what you want, this is what you get. And it's all at very small scales. So while you might think that, well, I don't want my line to be blurry, it's not really a matter of it being blurry, it's a matter of nuance to your thicknesses and your line quality. Long story short, these presets are going to look crappy. And these presets will actually look more accurate. Because it's designed to be a photo, it's designed to take a wider range of values, which is what we're after. Anyways, I was getting distracted with that. So back to our leaves. Once you've constructed all of these little center lines, you want to construct your leaves around them. And since there's so many leaves, it still feels a little bit overwhelming, but if you deal with each one at a time, it's much more manageable, and you can focus on the problem of, well, I got my center line and I want to construct my leaf around it. And then from here you might go and add that extra detail or whatever it is. Like these have somewhat wavier lines, so you might do that. And you can always use line weight to help make these initial construction lines disappear, but what you don't want to do is draw the initial construction lines timidly. Because when you draw timidly, your lines are going to wobble, they're going to be faint, they're not going to be confident, and you want them to be confident. That's of the utmost importance. Every single line you draw should be, first you should think through whether or not you gain from drawing that line, and then if you do, if it helps you understand the forms you're drawing or helps capture them, then you want to draw it with confidence. And that's where you're going to start improving, because at first, drawing with confidence, it's going to be undue confidence. You're not actually going to be able to draw that line very well. But by forcing yourself to always act like you can and then fail, you're going to learn from those failures, because that's how you develop. You reflect upon your failures, you see what you did wrong, and your muscles also do the same thing in a less conscious fashion. And they learn that, okay, this is what Master wanted, and this isn't what Master got, so I need to tweak how I do it. And yes, brain is the master, and your muscles are your little slaves. And they should be working for you, and you shouldn't be working against them. You should be trusting them to do what they do best, and that is draw confidently. Whenever you draw timidly, it's because you're overthinking it, and your brain is getting in the way, and you don't want to do that. Remember that if you're drawing timidly, it's likely because you're too preoccupied with the quality of the final drawing, which makes sense, but like I said before, we're not here to draw pretty drawings, we're here to learn how to draw, and that means failing a lot. So, I have one more example to show you, and it'll be a quick one because this video is running really long. So, the last one is a pomegranate plant. So I did the exact same thing here. I traced over it, And so you can see that I got a big sphere here, a cylinder, and some more cylinders. And you'll see in the lesson that there are some initial exercises about drawing these leaves with center lines or whatever, and also one for drawing tubes, which are very useful when you draw stems, and so on and so forth. So the other thing here to be very aware of is that when you have two forms, actually that's a poor example. You can see that I'm drawing this is a cylinder and this is a sphere, right? But the important thing to be aware of here is that this here is not just one end of the cylinder, it's the point of intersection, or the shape of intersection, the area of intersection between the cylinder and the sphere. Being aware of these points of intersection is super important. If you look at this pomegranate, the point of intersection is actually not visible. No, that's a poor color to use. It's not very visible either. So it's actually on the other side of it. So you would have to have X-ray vision to actually see this. But since we understand that this is a cylinder and this is a sphere, that's how they're going to intersect. There's a point, there's an area on the surface of the sphere that the cylinder is going to stop at. Being aware of this is a big step towards understanding how things sit in 3D space and understanding how your forms are in fact three-dimensional. If you were to just draw this, that doesn't tell you anything. That's just a bunch of 2D shapes. It's not very useful. As soon as you add this intersection, you start to understand that, oh, this is a sphere that its surface, even on the opposite side, leads up like this. And then maybe on the visible side, it goes up like that. And then this same kind of surface can be seen distorting onto the cylinder and going straight down. These are all important tricks to force your brain to think in 3 dimensions instead of just 2. Because it is a big challenge to get over the fact that you're drawing on a flat page, or like me, a flat screen. You're working against the misconceptions that your tools are giving you. If you were 3D modeling, then it would be no problem, because you'd be moving around, or if you were modeling with clay or whatever, you'd be able to see that this is clearly a 3D form, because it is a 3D form. But here we have to deal with illusions, because everything we draw ultimately is in 2 dimensions. But you can't let that impact how you think about it. You have to think about everything as 3D objects. Those intersections are extremely important. And so here I did the same thing as before. I drew my sphere. I have my areas of intersection, and it leads out into actually I drew a cylinder here, and then I drew a sort of nub, like a half sphere or something like that. And here I've got another one of those invisible intersections, because here I clearly drew it at a completely different angle, a different orientation. So this intersection, this line here, is actually visible to me. This one is not. Whereas in this case, it's almost barely visible, but not really, because you're looking at it straight on. This orientation is a little bit more dynamic. And that sort of awareness of the one being visible and one not, like you'll see it a lot when I do organic forms. I always have one side of the form visible, and then one side is not, like that would be there. It helps you maintain that illusion of 3D space, because if everything was 2D, you wouldn't see that end on either side. You would just see it straight and even. Like you're looking at it, like this is a valid perspective to be viewing this from. but it's just not interesting, and it doesn't read terribly as being three-dimensional, because you're not seeing either end of it. It's just flat. And you can get those kinds of flat orientations even in 3D space, but they're things that you want to avoid. And that's where the whole artistic license or designing your composition or designing whatever you're doing comes in. It's not a big deal right now because we're dealing with the more rudimentary challenges of construction. But down the line, you are going to want to take your reference images or whatever, and you're going to want to play with them. And so these are important decisions to make. How do I want my object to be oriented to best read what I'm trying to communicate to the viewer? That's ultimately what all of this is. You're communicating concepts to the viewer. And that's pretty much all I have to say on the topic. This video went way longer than I planned. I talked way too much, but hopefully this was helpful. And so what's left is for you guys to go to lesson 3, assuming you've completed the first 2. These are definitely prerequisites. Once you complete lessons 1 and 2, you have the option of moving on to the dynamic sketching and constructive drawing, or you can move on to the human figures stuff, which at this point I am hoping to swap out in the future, because I'm not terribly happy with these lessons and I can certainly do a lot better. So in the coming future, I mean, I'm going to be doing these videos and redoing demos for all 5 of these dynamic sketching lessons. And then once that's done, I'll start moving on to rewriting and redoing the human figure lessons. It's remarkable how much I've learned about how other people learn material by doing all of these critiques and whatnot that I've been doing for them. And it's actually quite remarkable how many critiques I've had to do. I've got some homework lined up right now, 5 of them I think. But as you can see, over the past, hasn't even been a year as I started recording this at the beginning of last September, but I'm already at over 1,600 homework submissions that I've critiqued. So yeah, I keep busy. But anyways, so yeah, that's pretty much it. Make sure that you do the basic page of leaves and page of stems exercises first and do them carefully. Think about the lines that you're drawing before you draw them. Apply the ghosting method. Don't chicken scratch. Don't think on the page. Think in your head, plan, and then draw the line that you've planned out. And then you can get through the demos, which I'm actually going to be re-recording today. So yeah, thanks for watching.